I love this video for the way that it illustrates the treasures that are all around us in every moment when we turn to one another, especially in those mundane moments, like riding the subway or washing dishes, sitting in traffic. We could see in that video the longing. As we can see in the video, the longing, we can see that longing as we walk down the street or we're at the grocery store. We long to share our lives with each other. Perhaps the most natural thing about us is this yearning to witness and be witnessed in shared experience. Anyone who has been in the company of children knows that we come into the world with the question, will you play with me? In good fortune, we leave the world in a swirl of memories. Those memories of laughing and playing and loving and holding and crying, adventuring, grieving, learning, growing, and healing with our peoples. And some of those memories are made by swimming against the currents of the mainstream. Thank you so much, Tere, for your bravery and your eloquence in sharing the parts of you that swim against the mainstream. And I'd never thought about the intersectionality of partners in that swim, like I'm thinking about it now because of your testimony. Sometimes our upstream swimming partners come from our family. Sometimes they come from communities of our cultural heritage. Sometimes they come from our church or our coworkers. And sometimes they come from other marginalized groups who we identify with. We swim against the current with a diverse group of co-swimmers. And I think there's hope in that. As I thought about what I might say today, I was wondering, where do we see examples of swims against the current in nature? And you're probably right now thinking what it took me a long time to start thinking, salmon. Salmon. Salmon begin their life in fresh water. They migrate to the ocean to feed and to grow. And then they return to that very same freshwater, the same freshwater streams of their birth to spawn their own offspring, the next generation of salmon. Atlantic salmon leave their birth streams to travel over 6,000 miles in the North Atlantic Ocean before they return home to spawn. Along their ocean journey, they orient themselves is by the Earth's gravitational pull. But that's not how they find home. When it's time to find home, they find their birthplace because when they were little baby salmon, they memorized the smell of their stream, of their birth stream. The sense of smell guides them to the very place they were born, their parents were born, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, on back for thousands of years of salmon. Sometimes the salmon, they have to swim upstream for 200 miles. As I follow the proverbial rabbit hole, AKA Google hole, into the secret lives of salmon this week, I found that there's a word for swimming upstream. It's anadromous. It's from the Greek ana, up, and dromos, running. And guess what? Each one of us has a story to tell about the parts of us that have had to swim against the currents, each and every one. Those stories we have to tell may be personal, they may be ancestral, to varying degrees in different contexts. Those structures that we live within of privilege, power, oppression, and marginalization impact the degree to which we are aware of our stories. I'm going to say that again. Those structures that we move in, those structures of privilege, power, oppression, and marginalization, they impact the degree to which we are aware of our stories. But we all have stories. And so do our parents, and so do our grandparents, and so do our great-grandparents on back. Not always, but many times that swim, like the salmon's, is a return swim. It's back to where we began. In the films The Wizard of Oz and The Wiz, which we have been looking into these last few weeks, the Dorothys are carried off by tornadoes in two very different American contexts. The White Dorothy, played by Judy Garland in the 1942 film The Wizard of Oz, is lifted off the ground with her Kansas farmhouse to a fantastical farm country of Oz. The Black Dorothy, played by Diana Ross in the 1978 film The Wiz, is carried away with her dog, Toto. She's carried from the African-American borough of Harlem in New York City, and she arrives in an urban, fantastical Oz. Both Dorothys, as soon as they leave, are stricken with a longing to return home. The whole entire film is about returning home. Isn't that how it is sometimes? We need to leave. We need to search for that somewhere over the rainbow, and yet, even in our leaving, we long to return. Finally, at the end of the story, Dorothy returns home. At the end of the 1942 film set in Kansas, Dorothy shares a piece of wisdom that she has learned from her adventures. She declares, "If I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't go further than my own backyard." We heard stories shared by Parksiders these last few weeks, and today we heard Tere tell about her parents' unconditional love in making that heart-wrenching decision to leave home on a quest for a new and better home for their family in the United States. That same painful decision is being made by parents, aunties, uncles, grandparents at kitchen tables right now in Mexico and Guatemala, Honduras, and many other places in the world. And then there are stories of those who were denied access to their own backyards, either because of migration and an inability to return because of an unjust immigration system, or because of identity. We know the LGBTQ+ community has historically and continuously longed to look in their own backyards for their heart's desires, but they couldn't because their backyards are no longer accessible to them. As Reverend Rajiv shared last week, a leading cause of youth homelessness is cited as religious difference in the home. After further exploration, he learned that that term is actually a euphemism for a gross form of child abuse, in my opinion. It's where queer youth are being kicked out of their parents' homes, their families' homes, for their queerness. Why? Because church. And here's where Jesus comes in. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus tells a one-sentence story. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which someone found and hid. And then in his joy, he goes and sells all his field. The story is part of a series of several stories about the value of kingdom life. In other words, there is nothing of the comforts in the material world that will satisfy heal, restore the soul more than living in God's kingdom of shalom. For Jesus, his somewhere over the rainbow included this shalom understanding of a peace that is built on a relational network of loving kindness between humans, between human and non-human creatures in the world, between humans and the land, the air, and water. How do we get there? In Jesus' story, it's pretty simple. We invest everything that we have in the whole field. Not just the treasure, but in the whole field where the treasure is hidden. And as I close today, I'm going to take us a bit deeper into that field of our backyards. Because we know we're finding out more and more every day. Some of us have known for a very long time that there is more than treasure hidden in the field of our own backyards. Last week, Reverend Rajiv shared a global news story about an uncovered, unmarked grave where the bones of 215 indigenous babies had been discarded by the administrators of the Kamloops Indian Residential School in Canada. The remains were discovered by a First Nation people who are investigating the deaths of residential school students in Western Canada. Residential schools like that one operated in the U.S. well into the 20th century. These institutions were designed to assimilate Native Americans into U.S. society forcibly, often using cruel methods of indoctrination. Indigenous people have borne this horrible truth for decades. Many of their children who died while in custody of these schools were put in unmarked graves, and the bodies were never returned to their parents, whether the death was due to natural causes, disease, abuse, or neglect. So let's just take a moment with this story. This is in the field of our own backyard. Let your humanity, the human part of yourself, the part that feels, take that story in. Because that is the same field, dear ones, that holds the hidden treasure of the hope that we are looking for. It also holds the desecrating sacrilege, these bones, never making it back to their own backyards and their loved ones' arms. All of the collective trauma experts, of which Jesus himself was one, I think, they tell us that we must feel this pain together. The pain of the only relational dynamic that we seem to know, because it has been perpetuated often in the mainstream culture for centuries, the dynamic of victim-perpetrator. There has to be other ways of relating to one another than that. There is a treasure of kingdom life that awaits us. But how do we get there? We get there through collectively healing. And collective healing does not come without collective feeling. At this point in our history, I believe that we must all be on a huge upstream swim. For some who have been able to coast on down that mainstream current, that swim upstream is going to be very hard. Those muscles will need to develop. It's going to be uncomfortable. For others whose lives and bodies have been toned by swimming upstream for a long time, it might not be so hard. This is how justice works. How can we find the treasure in the field of our own backyard when that field hides more than treasure? And here Jesus helps us. He speaks of selling all, of sacrificing the things that feed our fear of each other. Let those go. Selling those things that foster our spiritual numbness, get rid of it. Those things that that cause us to resist loving our neighbors, sell that stuff. For some, it may mean that we have to shed our material more than we needness. For others, it will require a radical redistribution of our priorities with time and with energy and with our talents and skills. Instead of operating to ensure just my comfort and the comfort of my family, materially and spiritually, those priorities will need to shift to fostering and to ensuring a shared comfort and a shared well-being. The only way out of our hurt, of the hurt that we're in, and we're in some hurt, is through it. It's through it. Dear ones at Parkside, here's my call. Here's my hope. Here's my ask of myself and all of us together, especially as we are preparing to come together again in person. Let us do our part, Parksiders. Let us co-create a space where hurt, collective and individual hurts, are witnessed, honored, felt by each other, because this is the solve. This is the healing. This is what binds those wounds. This is the way to the somewhere over the rainbow in our own backyards. May it be so. Amen.